The abandoned farmhouse on Maple Ridge had been boarded up for 30 years, but when the blizzard of the century slammed into northern Montana, construction foreman Jake Morrison had no choice but to break in or freeze to death. The temperature was dropping fast, and his truck had died 2 miles back on the desolate country road. Inside, with no heat and the wind howling through broken windows, Jake knew he had maybe 2 hours before hypothermia claimed him. That's when he spotted the loose floorboards in the kitchen. Jake wasn't just any construction worker. He was ex-military demolitions, and he recognized structural weaknesses instantly. Desperate for insulation, he began prying up the rotted planks, planning to create a makeshift shelter in the crawl space below. But what Jake found beneath those floorboards wasn't dirt and foundation stones. It was a perfectly preserved underground chamber filled with files, photographs, and evidence of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of local government. And suddenly, the blizzard became the least of his worries. Why had someone gone to such lengths to hide this room, and what were they willing to do to keep it secret? Jake's hands trembled as he held his phone's flashlight over the opening. The beam revealed a wooden ladder descending into what looked like a finished basement room. The air rising from below carried a musty scent mixed with something else, something chemical and sharp that made his nostrils burn. His survival instincts warred with curiosity. The chamber would provide better shelter than the drafty kitchen, but every fiber of his being screamed that he was about to cross a line he couldn't uncross. The wind rattled the boarded windows above him, making the decision for him. He swung his legs over the edge and climbed down. The chamber was roughly 12 by 15 feet, with concrete walls and a surprisingly intact ceiling. Filing cabinets lined one wall, while the others were covered with photographs, maps, and documents pinned to corkboards. A desk sat in the corner, its surface cleared except for an ashtray and a leather-bound journal. Jake moved closer to examine the photographs. His breath caught. They showed children, dozens of them. Some he recognized from old missing person cases he'd heard whispered about in town, kids who'd supposedly run away or gotten lost in the wilderness. But these photos showed them in what looked like institutional settings, wearing numbered tags around their necks. His hands shook as he reached for the nearest file cabinet. The drawer slid open easily, revealing manila folders organized by year, stretching back to the 1960s. He pulled one at random, Subject 47, Behavioral Modification Protocol C. Inside were medical records, psychological evaluations, and progress reports written in cold, clinical language that made his stomach churn. The names on the documents made him dizzy. Dr. Richard Henley, his own family physician growing up. Sheriff Tom Bratton, still in office today. Mayor Patricia Wells, who'd cut the ribbon at Jake's construction company's grand opening just last year. All of them, signing off on procedures and treatments that sounded more like torture than medicine. Jake grabbed the journal from the desk, his fingers numb with more than just cold. The handwriting was meticulous, recording dates, subjects, and outcomes with scientific precision. One entry made him sink into the desk chair. November 15, 1987, Subject 23, J. Morrison, age 7, shows continued resistance to Protocol A. Recommend transfer to long-term observation. Note, father asking questions may require intervention. The journal slipped from his hands. Subject 23, J. Morrison, his own name, his own age when his family had moved away from Maple Ridge for his father's work. He'd never understood why they'd left so suddenly, why his parents had refused to talk about their time here, why his mother had nightmares for years afterward. Now he was beginning to understand. Frantically, he flipped through more pages. There, another entry about his father, Daniel Morrison, becoming problematic and requiring permanent solution. His father had died in a construction accident 6 months after they'd moved, an accident that had never quite made sense, even to 7-year-old Jake. The sound of engines cut through the howling wind above. Jake froze, listening. Multiple vehicles, driving slowly despite the blizzard conditions. Nobody should be out in this weather, especially not way out here on Maple Ridge. He scrambled to the ladder and climbed high enough to peer through the broken kitchen window. 3 black SUVs were pulling up to the farmhouse, their headlights cutting through the snow. Men in heavy coats were getting out, and even in the dim light, Jake could see they were armed. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stay where you are, Jake. We're here to help." Nobody knew he was here. Nobody except whoever had been watching the house, waiting for someone to finally discover what lay beneath. Jake looked at the files scattered around the chamber, then at the armed figures moving toward the farmhouse. 30 years this room had waited in darkness, 30 years of secrets, perfectly preserved like specimens in a lab. And now, with the worst blizzard in decades providing cover, someone was coming to make sure those secrets stayed buried forever. The wind had grown teeth overnight, gnawing at the house's weathered bones with relentless hunger. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter and pressed his face to the frost-covered window, watching snow devils dance across what used to be the yard. The storm had erased the world beyond 20 feet, turning everything into a white void that seemed to swallow sound itself. His phone showed no bars, just the mocking outline of a tower with a slash through it. The battery had dropped to 30%, despite his efforts to conserve power. He'd already shut off everything non-essential, keeping only the flashlight app ready for when darkness claimed the house completely. The cold had settled into his bones like a living thing, making his fingers stiff and his breath visible in crystalline puffs. Every surface in the house wore a thin skin of ice, and frost crept along the walls in delicate patterns that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Now they just reminded him how thoroughly winter had invaded his temporary shelter. Marcus paced the main room, stomping his feet to maintain circulation. The abandoned furniture, a sagging couch, a wooden table missing one leg, scattered chairs with torn upholstery, offered no comfort. Newspapers from what looked like the early 2000s were scattered across the floor, their headlines speaking of local elections and high school football games from a simpler time. He tried burning some for warmth, but the brief flare of heat they provided wasn't worth depleting his limited supply of kindling. His stomach clenched with hunger. The protein bar he'd found in his truck's glove compartment had only sharpened his appetite rather than satisfying it. Water wasn't an immediate concern. He could melt snow, but food would become critical if the storm lasted another day. As afternoon shadows began their early winter retreat, Marcus noticed something that made him pause. Near the back corner of the house, where the kitchen met what might have been a mudroom, the floorboards sagged noticeably. More importantly, cold air seemed to rise from the gap between the boards, carrying with it a smell that was different from the rest of the house. Not just old wood and decay, but something earthier, deeper. He knelt and pressed his palm to the floor. The boards were definitely warmer here, and when he put his ear down, he could swear he heard the faint whisper of moving air. A basement, maybe, or a root cellar. Either way, it represented possibility, shelter below ground level, protection from the wind, maybe even stored supplies. The floorboards were old but solid, held down by nails that had rusted into the wood over decades. Marcus retrieved his hammer from the toolbox and began working at the corner where the sagging was worst. The first nail shrieked as it pulled free, the sound unnaturally loud in the storm-muffled silence. 20 minutes of careful work revealed a trapdoor that had been concealed beneath the loose boards. The wooden panel was heavy, swollen with moisture and age, but it lifted on protesting hinges to reveal a set of stone steps descending into darkness. The earthy smell grew stronger, mixed now with something else, a metallic tang that made his nose wrinkle. Marcus aimed his phone's flashlight into the opening. The steps were carved from local stone, worn smooth by years of use but still solid. They disappeared into blackness after a dozen feet, but the space below seemed substantial. Most importantly, no wind reached up from the depths, and the air felt noticeably warmer. He called down into the darkness, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Hello? Anyone down there?" The words came back to him distorted, as if the underground chamber was larger than the house above. No response came, but he hadn't really expected one. The smart thing would be to wait until morning, to descend when he could see clearly and think straight. But the temperature in the house continued to drop, and his phone battery wouldn't last much longer. Whatever was down there had to be better than slowly freezing in the abandoned rooms above. Marcus gathered his tools and the few supplies he'd salvaged from his truck. The beam of his flashlight carved a pale tunnel through the darkness as he placed his first tentative step on the stone stairs. The rock was solid beneath his boot, worn smooth but not slippery. As he descended, the walls closed around him, fitted stone that spoke of old craftsmanship, the kind that built things to last. The air grew warmer with each step, though the metallic smell intensified. His light swept across the walls, revealing tool marks and occasional gaps between stones where the mortar had cracked with age. 12 steps down, his flashlight beam found the floor, packed earth covered with what looked like canvas tarps. The space was indeed larger than he'd expected, stretching beyond his light's reach in multiple directions, but it was the shapes under those tarps that made him stop breathing. They were too regular, too intentional to be storage or supplies. They looked like bodies. The wind hammered against the walls with renewed fury as Marcus descended into the hole, his work boots finding purchase on the makeshift ladder of broken floorboards he'd wedged against the earthen sides. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness below, revealing more than he'd bargained for. What he'd initially mistaken for a root cellar stretched far beyond the foundation's footprint. The space opened into a narrow corridor that seemed to run beneath the entire length of the house, its walls lined with what appeared to be hand-cut stone. The air down here carried a different quality, not just cold but ancient, heavy with the weight of secrets. Marcus dropped the remaining distance, his breath forming thick clouds in the frigid air. The temperature difference was noticeable. While still freezing, the underground space offered blessed relief from the wind's relentless assault. He pulled his coat tighter and began exploring. The corridor extended in both directions, disappearing beyond his flashlight's reach. To his left, wooden shelves lined the walls, their contents long since claimed by time and moisture. Broken mason jars lay scattered across the floor, their metal lids corroded beyond recognition. This part, at least, matched his theory about a root cellar. But to his right, the space transformed into something else entirely. Marcus followed the beam of his flashlight deeper into the corridor, his footsteps echoing strangely in the confined space. The stone walls here showed tool marks, deliberate and precise. Someone had spent considerable time and effort expanding this underground network, and they'd done it with purpose. 20 feet from where he'd entered, the corridor opened into a larger chamber. Marcus stepped inside and immediately knew he'd stumbled onto something far more significant than a simple storage space. The room stretched roughly 15 feet square, its ceiling supported by thick wooden beams that showed no signs of rot despite their obvious age. Against the far wall, a series of metal filing cabinets stood in perfect rows, their surfaces dulled but intact. A heavy wooden desk occupied the center of the space, its drawers slightly ajar as if someone had left in haste. Marcus approached the desk cautiously, his flashlight beam dancing across its surface. Papers lay scattered across the top, their edges yellowed and brittle. He picked up the nearest document, squinting at the faded typewriter text. Property Assessment, Millbrook Development Corporation, March 1987. The name meant nothing to him, but the date sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cold. 1987 was the year the Hartwell family had disappeared, the year this house had been abandoned. He gathered more papers, his hands trembling slightly as he read. Purchase agreements, survey maps, geological reports, all bearing the same corporate letterhead and the same time period. But it was the handwritten notes in the margins that made his blood run cold. Families relocated as planned. Evidence disposed of per protocol. Local authorities compensated. Marcus set the papers down and moved to the filing cabinets. The first drawer slid open with a rusty screech that seemed to echo through the underground chamber like a scream. Inside, manila folders hung in neat rows, each labeled with a name and date. His flashlight beam moved across the tabs and his breath caught. Hartwell James, family of 4, March 15, 1987. Morrison Sarah, single female, March 22, 1987. Chen David, family of 3, April 2, 1987. Dozens of folders, all from the same 3-month period, all listing what appeared to be families and individuals, along with dates. Marcus pulled the Hartwell file, his hands shaking as he opened it. Inside were photographs, surveillance shots of a man, woman, and 2 young children going about their daily lives. The images showed them at a grocery store, walking to school, playing in a yard that Marcus now realized was directly above his head. Paperwork documented their daily routines, their habits, even their relationships with neighbors. But it was the final document in the folder that made Marcus's knees weak. A single sheet of paper with a red stamp across the top, relocation complete, March 15, 1987. Below the stamp, in the same handwriting he'd seen on the desk, someone had written, basement sealed, property cleared for development. Marcus's flashlight beam wavered as the implications hit him. These weren't relocation files. The families hadn't been moved. They'd been eliminated. A sound from above froze him in place, the distinct creak of floorboards under weight. Someone was in the house. Marcus killed his flashlight immediately, plunging the chamber into absolute darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs as he listened. Footsteps moved slowly across the floor above, methodical and searching. They knew he was here. Somehow, they knew he'd found this place. In the suffocating darkness of the underground chamber, surrounded by evidence of atrocities committed decades ago, Marcus realized that his fight for survival had taken on an entirely new dimension. The blizzard was no longer his greatest threat. The people who'd killed to keep these secrets buried had found him. The photograph trembled in Jake's frozen fingers as he held it closer to the flickering candlelight. The woman's face stared back at him with familiar eyes, eyes he'd seen every morning in the mirror for 32 years. The same deep brown color, the same slight upturn at the corners, the same stubborn jawline his father had always complained about. But that was impossible. This woman looked exactly like his mother, Sarah Brennan, except younger, much younger. And according to the faded writing on the back, this photo was taken in 1987, 3 years before Jake was even born. His hands shook as he set the photograph aside and reached for the manila envelope. The paper crackled like autumn leaves as he opened it, revealing a birth certificate that made his blood run cold. Baby girl Connolly. Born, March 15, 1987. Mother, Sarah Elizabeth Connolly. Father, unknown. Jake's mother's maiden name was Hendricks, not Connolly. And she'd told him countless times that he was her first and only child, born when she was barely 18. But this certificate suggested she'd had another child 3 years before Jake was born, a daughter. He fumbled through more papers with growing desperation. Medical records, all bearing his mother's name but the wrong dates. A high school transcript showing she'd graduated in 1986, not 1989 as she'd always claimed. And then, at the bottom of the stack, a newspaper clipping that made his heart stop entirely. Local teen missing after family dispute read the headline from the Millbrook Gazette, dated April 2, 1987. Below it, a grainy photograph showed a young woman holding an infant. The caption identified her as Sarah Connolly, 17, who had disappeared from her family home along with her 3-week-old daughter. Jake's vision blurred. The candle flame seemed to dance mockingly as he read the article again, searching for some explanation that would make sense of what he was seeing. According to the newspaper, Sarah Connolly had been involved in a bitter dispute with her wealthy father, Thomas Connolly, over her refusal to give up the baby for adoption. She'd vanished one night, taking the child with her, and neither had been seen since. Thomas Connolly. Jake knew that name. The Connolly family had been one of Millbrook's founding families, their name still gracing half the buildings downtown. But the family had supposedly died out decades ago when the last heir moved away. A sound from upstairs made Jake freeze, a slow, deliberate creak, as if someone was walking carefully across the old floorboards. He held his breath, listening intently. The wind had died down outside, making the house unnaturally quiet except for the settling of ancient timbers. Another creak. Definitely footsteps. Jake quickly gathered the photographs and papers, stuffing them back into the envelope. His mind raced as he tried to process what he'd discovered. If the documents were real, then his mother had lied to him about everything, her past, her family, maybe even his own identity. But why? The footsteps overhead moved toward what sounded like the staircase. Jake blew out the candle, plunging the basement into complete darkness. He clutched the envelope against his chest and felt his way toward the hole he'd dug, pressing himself against the cold earth wall. Someone was definitely in the house now. The footsteps descended the stairs slowly, accompanied by the beam of a powerful flashlight that cut through the darkness above his head. Jake held his breath, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain whoever was up there could hear it. "I know you're down there," a voice called out. It was calm, almost conversational, with a slight accent Jake couldn't place. "Found your truck out front. Figured you might have wandered inside to wait out the storm." The beam of light swept across the basement floor, passing inches from where Jake crouched in the shadows. He pressed himself deeper into the excavated space, feeling loose dirt cascade down his back. "Name's Detective Morrison. I'm with the County Sheriff's Department. Just want to make sure you're okay down there. This old place isn't safe, especially with all this snow putting stress on the roof." Jake wanted to believe the voice, wanted to call out and identify himself. But something held him back. Maybe it was the way the man had said detective without the usual authority cops carried in their voices, or maybe it was the timing. What were the odds that a detective would show up at this particular house on this particular night, just after Jake had uncovered evidence of a decades-old disappearance? The flashlight beam moved methodically across the basement, and Jake realized it was only a matter of time before it found him. He felt along the wall behind him, searching for another way out, but his fingers met only solid stone and earth. The light suddenly stopped moving. In the silence, Jake could hear the man breathing somewhere near the bottom of the stairs. "Interesting," the voice said, and Jake heard footsteps moving directly toward his hiding spot. "Looks like someone's been doing a little digging." The metal box felt impossibly heavy in Marcus's frozen hands as he climbed back up from the cellar. His flashlight beam danced across the basement walls one last time, revealing the gaping hole he'd torn in the earth, a wound that had bled secrets instead of blood. The temperature seemed to have dropped even further, if that was possible, and his breath came in sharp puffs that crystallized almost instantly. Back in the main room, Marcus set the box on what remained of an old wooden table. The surface was warped and stained, but it held. He positioned his flashlight to illuminate the container, noting how the metal had resisted decades of moisture and cold. Someone had wanted these contents preserved. The latch opened with surprising ease, as if it had been designed to be accessed again. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be oiled cloth, were photographs, documents, and a leather journal bound with string. Marcus's hands trembled, from cold or anticipation he couldn't tell, as he carefully lifted out the first bundle. The photographs made his stomach lurch. Black and white images of children, some no older than 8 or 9, standing in what looked like the very basement he'd just emerged from. But these weren't innocent family photos. The children's eyes held a haunting emptiness, and many bore visible signs of malnutrition and abuse. In several photos, adults in expensive clothing stood behind the children like hunters with their trophies. Marcus recognized the basement immediately. The stone walls, the wooden support beams, even the peculiar arch of the ceiling. This house had been used for something unspeakable, and someone had documented it meticulously. He set the photographs aside with shaking hands and reached for the documents. Official letterheads caught his eye, police reports, medical examiner findings, and correspondence on town council stationery. As he read, a pattern emerged that made his blood run cold. Missing children from the 1970s and early 1980s. investigations that were suddenly dropped, evidence that disappeared from police custody, medical reports that concluded natural deaths for children who showed clear signs of trauma, and signatures, dozens of signatures from people whose names he recognized as pillars of the community. Chief of Police Harold Brennan, Mayor Elizabeth Thorne, Dr. Richard Ashworth from the hospital, Judge William Hartley, all names that graced street signs and memorial plaques throughout town, all signatures on documents that covered up systematic abuse and murder. The leather journal was the worst. Written in a careful, educated hand, it detailed experiments conducted on homeless and runaway children who wouldn't be missed. The author, who signed himself only as the benefactor, described psychological and physical torture with the clinical detachment of a scientist studying lab rats. Marcus had to stop reading twice to vomit, though his empty stomach produced nothing but bile. The dates in the journal spanned nearly a decade, with entries describing dozens of victims. The final entry was dated December 15, 1983, exactly 40 years ago to the day. "The operation must cease," it read. "External pressures have grown too intense, and questions are being asked that we cannot answer indefinitely. The facility will be abandoned and sealed. All physical evidence will be disposed of according to Protocol 7. The participants will maintain absolute silence or face the consequences outlined in their agreements. This knowledge dies with us." But it hadn't died. Someone had preserved it all, hidden it beneath the house like a time bomb waiting to explode. Marcus wondered who had compiled this evidence and why they'd never used it. Perhaps they'd died before they could. Perhaps they'd been silenced. The wind outside reached a new pitch of fury, rattling the windows so violently that Marcus feared they might shatter. He gathered the materials, carefully rewrapping them in their protective cloth. His mind raced as he tried to process what he'd discovered. These weren't just historical crimes. Some of these people might still be alive. Judge Hartley had retired only 5 years ago. Dr. Ashworth's son now ran the hospital. The connections, the power structures, the silence that had protected these monsters for 4 decades might still be intact. A new sound cut through the wind's howl, the distant rumble of an engine. Marcus froze, listening intently. Vehicle engines had a distinctive quality in heavy snow, muffled but persistent. Someone was out in the blizzard, moving slowly but deliberately, coming toward the house. Marcus quickly closed the metal box and tucked it under his arm. His paranoia might be getting the better of him, but after what he'd just read, the idea of coincidence felt dangerously naive. He moved to the front window and peered through a gap in the boarded exterior. Headlights pierced the swirling snow, still distant but definitely approaching. In weather like this, no one ventured out unless they had to, unless they had a very specific destination in mind. Marcus grabbed his shovel and the box, his mind racing through options as the lights grew steadily brighter. Whatever was coming through that blizzard, he had a sinking feeling it wasn't a rescue. The storm had become a living thing, its howls penetrating every crack and crevice of the old house. Marcus huddled closer to his makeshift fire, feeding it scraps of broken furniture he'd found scattered throughout the rooms. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating phantoms that seemed to watch his every move. He couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. The face that looked so much like his own stared back from the crumpled paper, now tucked safely in his jacket pocket. The questions multiplied with each gust of wind. Who was this man? Why did he look like Marcus? And why had someone felt the need to bury evidence of his existence beneath this house? The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling toward the ceiling. Marcus realized he needed more fuel if he wanted to survive the night. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the temperature had dropped even further. His breath formed thick clouds in the air despite the meager warmth from the flames. He grabbed his flashlight and began exploring the house more systematically. The ground floor yielded little beyond rotted floorboards and mouse droppings, but as he climbed the creaking stairs to the second level, something caught his attention. A door at the end of the hallway stood slightly ajar, and unlike the others, this one had a newer lock, one that had been broken recently. Marcus pushed the door open and stepped inside what had once been a bedroom. Dust motes danced in his flashlight beam, but the room felt different somehow, less abandoned. He swept the light across the floor and froze. Someone had been here, recently. Fresh footprints marked the dusty floor, leading to a window that faced the road. The prints were large, made by heavy boots, not work boots like his own, but something more military in style. Marcus approached the window and peered out through the grime-streaked glass. The storm made it impossible to see beyond a few feet, but he could make out what looked like tire tracks in the snow below, already being filled by the relentless wind. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Someone had been watching the house, maybe watching him. He turned to leave but stopped when his flashlight illuminated something carved into the wooden windowsill. Letters, crude but deliberate, they know. Marcus's pulse quickened. He examined the carving more closely. The cuts looked fresh, made within the last few days. Below the warning, in smaller letters, someone had scratched a single word: run. The wind suddenly died outside, and in the eerie silence that followed, Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze. The distant rumble of an engine growing closer. He killed the flashlight and pressed himself against the wall beside the window. Through the storm, he could see headlights cutting through the darkness, moving slowly up the access road. The vehicle stopped about 50 yards from the house, its engine idling. Marcus held his breath. After what felt like an eternity, the engine shut off. Car doors slammed, at least 2, maybe 3. Voices carried on the wind, too muffled to make out words, but the tone was urgent, purposeful. He had to get downstairs and put out the fire. The smoke would give away his presence if it hadn't already. Marcus crept toward the stairs, each footstep carefully placed to avoid the worst creaks. Behind him, he heard the front door rattle as someone tested the handle. In the main room, his fire still burned cheerfully, oblivious to the danger it represented. Marcus kicked snow onto the flames, plunging the house into darkness just as the front door burst open. "Search every room," a voice commanded. The accent was local, but the authority was unmistakable. "If he found anything, we need to know." Marcus pressed himself behind the staircase, his heart hammering so loud he was sure they'd hear it. Flashlight beams swept across the room, and heavy footsteps moved through the house with military precision. "Fire's still warm," another voice reported. "Someone's been here recently. Check the basement." That's where the real problem would be. Marcus heard them moving toward the kitchen, toward the hole he'd dug. In moments, they'd find evidence of his excavation. His mind raced through options. The back door was his best bet, but getting there meant crossing open ground that might be illuminated by their lights. A new voice, younger than the others, spoke up. "Think it was the construction worker, the one whose truck got stuck. Doesn't matter who it was. Clean it up. All of it. And if we find whoever was digging around down there, the sentence didn't need completion." Marcus heard them descending into the basement, their voices growing muffled. This was his chance. He crept toward the back of the house, the photograph burning like a brand in his pocket. Whatever secret lay buried here, people were willing to kill for it. As he reached for the back door handle, he heard a shout from below. "Jesus Christ, look at this." They'd found his excavation site, and judging by their reaction, they'd found something else too, something that changed everything. The basement stairs groaned under Marcus's weight as he descended into the bowels of the house, his flashlight cutting through darkness that seemed almost solid. The temperature dropped with each step, his breath forming visible clouds that dissipated into the void ahead. Behind him, wind continued to assault the house above, but down here the storm felt distant, muffled by layers of rotting wood and decades of accumulated silence. The basement was larger than he'd expected, stretching beyond the reach of his light. Stone foundation walls glistened with moisture, and the air carried a musty smell mixed with something else, something chemical and sharp that made his nose burn. Old furniture huddled in corners like sleeping beasts, a rusted washer, broken chairs, cardboard boxes that had long since surrendered to dampness. Marcus swept the flashlight beam methodically across the space, searching for anything that might explain the photograph he'd found upstairs. The image of those men in hard hats, standing over what looked like construction equipment, had lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. One of the faces had seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where he'd seen it before. In the far corner, something glinted in the light. Marcus moved closer and discovered a metal filing cabinet, its green paint peeling like diseased skin. The top drawer hung slightly open, as if someone had left in a hurry and forgotten to close it. He pulled it wider, the screech of metal on metal echoing through the basement. Inside were folders, their manila surfaces stained but largely intact. Marcus pulled one out and opened it, angling his flashlight to read the contents. Construction permits all dated 37 years ago, site surveys for a development project called Millbrook Gardens. His eyes scanned the documents, noting signatures and official stamps, until one name stopped him cold. Thomas Crane, project foreman, Marcus's father. The flashlight trembled in his hand as he flipped through more documents. Thomas Crane's signature appeared again and again, approving materials, signing off on inspections, authorizing payments. But it was the final document in the folder that made Marcus's blood turn to ice water in his veins. A change order, dated 3 days before the project's scheduled completion. Authorization to dig an additional foundation for an unspecified purpose. The work was to be completed at night, with minimal crew, and all documentation was to be kept strictly confidential. At the bottom of the page, 2 signatures, Thomas Crane and someone named Robert Hartwell. Marcus rifled through more folders with growing urgency. More change orders, all similarly vague. Payments to trucking companies for material removal, invoices for concrete and rebar that didn't match the project's architectural plans, and photographs, dozens of them. The pictures showed construction in progress, but not the kind Marcus recognized. These weren't foundation footings for houses, they were deep excavations, concrete-lined chambers, and what looked suspiciously like drainage systems leading away from the main site. In several photos, he could make out his father's younger face beneath a hard hat, standing beside other men as they supervised the mysterious work. A loose photograph fell from one of the folders and landed at Marcus's feet. He bent to retrieve it and found himself staring at an image that made his stomach lurch. It showed a concrete chamber, maybe 8 feet square, with metal brackets embedded in the walls. Dark stains covered the floor, and in one corner, something that might have been fabric or rope. The chemical smell in the basement suddenly seemed stronger, more acrid. Marcus looked around with new eyes, noticing for the first time the discoloration in the concrete floor near the filing cabinet. A rough patch, as if the original floor had been broken up and repoured. The edges were uneven, amateur work that contrasted sharply with the professional masonry of the walls. He knelt beside the patched area and ran his fingers along its perimeter. The concrete was definitely newer than the rest, though still decades old. When he pressed his ear to the surface, he could swear he heard a hollow echo underneath. From somewhere above, a door slammed shut. Marcus froze, listening. The wind could have blown something closed, but the sound had been too deliberate, too controlled. Footsteps creaked across the floor overhead, slow and measured. Someone else was in the house. Marcus quickly gathered the most important documents and photographs, stuffing them inside his jacket. The footsteps moved toward the kitchen, then stopped. Whoever was up there was listening, just as Marcus was listening to them. He clicked off his flashlight, plunging the basement into absolute darkness. The footsteps resumed, moving now toward the basement door. Marcus felt his way carefully toward the stairs, each movement deliberate and silent. His heart hammered against his ribs as he realized the only way out was up those stairs, past whoever had entered the house. The basement door opened with a long, agonized creak. A beam of light stabbed down into the darkness, much brighter than Marcus's dying flashlight. Heavy boots began their descent, one careful step at a time. The basement felt different now, charged with an electricity that made Marcus's skin crawl. The skeletal remains lay before him like an accusation, and the child's drawing in his trembling hands seemed to pulse with significance he couldn't yet grasp. The storm above had grown quieter, but down here in this tomb-like space, the silence was deafening. Marcus forced himself to examine the skeleton more closely. The bones were small, delicate, definitely a child. Around the remains, he noticed fragments of rotted fabric that might have once been clothing. A tarnished button caught the flashlight beam, and nearby, something that made his breath catch. A small metal pendant on a broken chain. He picked it up carefully, brushing away decades of dirt. It was a simple silver cross, with initials engraved on the back. S&M. The metal was cold against his palm, and he felt an overwhelming sense of sadness wash over him, as if the pendant itself carried the weight of tragedy. The drawing crinkled as he shifted it to get a better look at the pendant. The stick-figure family stared up at him, mother, father, child, with those haunting black scribbles covering the adult figures' faces. But now he noticed something else. In the corner of the paper, in a child's unsteady handwriting, were letters that spelled out, "Help me." A sound from upstairs made him freeze. It was faint but unmistakable, the creak of a floorboard. Marcus killed the flashlight immediately, plunging himself into absolute darkness. His heart hammered as he strained to listen. There it was again, deliberate and careful, as if someone was trying to move quietly through the house above. The blizzard couldn't have stopped completely. No one should be able to reach this place. Unless they'd been watching, waiting for the right moment. Unless they knew what he might find down here. Marcus clutched the pendant and drawing, his mind racing. Whoever was upstairs, they weren't here by coincidence. The timing was too perfect, too calculated. Someone had been monitoring this house, this basement, this secret that had stayed buried for decades. The footsteps moved closer to what Marcus assumed was the basement entrance. He needed another way out, but his earlier exploration had revealed only solid walls. The basement was a trap, and he'd walked right into it. Light suddenly spilled down the stairs as a door opened above. Marcus pressed himself against the far wall, behind the furnace, clutching his flashlight like a weapon. The beam of another flashlight danced down the wooden steps, followed by the deliberate tread of boots. "I know you're down there, Marcus." The voice was calm, almost conversational. "We need to talk." Marcus recognized the voice. Sheriff Bradley, the man who'd seemed so helpful during his brief visit to town yesterday, the same man who'd mentioned the house's history with such careful vagueness. "Come on out, son. Let's discuss what you've found like civilized people." Marcus remained silent, his mind working furiously. The sheriff's presence here meant this went deeper than a single buried secret. This was organized, systematic. How many people in town knew what lay beneath this house? The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. Sheriff Bradley's flashlight swept the basement methodically, the beam growing closer to Marcus's hiding spot with each pass. "The thing about secrets, Marcus, is that they're only dangerous when the wrong people know them. We've been protecting this town for a long time, keeping things stable, keeping people safe. Sometimes that means making hard choices." The beam found the excavated area where the skeleton lay exposed. Sheriff Bradley let out a long sigh. "You just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you? Had to keep digging." There was genuine regret in his voice. Sarah Mitchell went missing 32 years ago. Her parents were problematic. They'd discovered some financial irregularities in the town's development projects, asked too many questions, threatened to go to state authorities. Marcus felt sick. The initials on the pendant, SM. Sarah Mitchell. A little girl who died because her parents had gotten too close to something powerful people wanted hidden. "The parents had an accident," Sheriff Bradley continued conversationally. "Car went off Miller's Bridge during an ice storm. Very tragic. But the girl, she saw things. New things. We couldn't take the risk. The flashlight beam swept closer. Marcus gripped his own light, knowing he'd have one chance when Bradley found him. The sheriff was armed, experienced, and had the advantage of knowing the terrain. The development money built this town into what it is today, Marcus. Brought jobs, prosperity, hope. Sometimes the greater good requires sacrifice. Sarah Mitchell's sacrifice meant hundreds of families had better lives. The beam stopped just inches from Marcus's position. In the silence, he could hear Sheriff Bradley's steady breathing, could smell the man's aftershave mixing with the musty basement air. Now you have a choice to make, son. You can be part of the solution, or you can join little Sarah in keeping our secret safe forever. The basement felt different now, charged with an electricity that made Marcus's skin crawl. The photograph trembled in his hands as he studied the faces more closely. The woman holding the infant looked familiar in a way that made his stomach twist. Her eyes, the shape of her nose, he'd seen those features before, but where? A sound from upstairs made him freeze. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving across the floorboards above his head. Marcus killed the flashlight and pressed himself against the cold stone wall, his breath coming in short, silent puffs. The footsteps continued, methodical and purposeful. Someone was searching the house. His mind raced. The blizzard was still raging outside. He could hear the wind howling through the gaps in the foundation. Who would venture out in weather like this? And more importantly, what were they looking for? The beam of a powerful flashlight suddenly pierced through the gaps in the basement ceiling, sweeping back and forth as the person above continued their search. Marcus clutched the photograph and documents to his chest, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. The footsteps moved toward the kitchen, directly above where he crouched. Dust and debris rained down as the person above seemed to pause, perhaps noticing something amiss. Marcus remembered the broken window he'd entered through, the snow he'd tracked inside. His presence wouldn't remain secret for long. A new sound made his blood turn to ice, the basement door creaking open. Light flooded down the wooden steps as the intruder began their descent. Marcus scrambled deeper into the shadows, behind the old furnace, pressing himself into the corner where the darkness was thickest. The papers crinkled softly in his grip, and he winced at the sound. "I know you're down here," a voice called out. It was gravelly, older, with an authority that suggested its owner was accustomed to being obeyed. "Might as well come out. We need to talk." Marcus held his breath, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain it would give him away. The flashlight beam swept across the basement methodically, illuminating the disturbed dirt where he'd been digging, the scattered tools, the open chest. "You found something you shouldn't have," the voice continued, closer now. "Something that was meant to stay buried. Do you understand what you've stumbled into?" The beam passed inches from Marcus's hiding spot. In its reflection off the furnace, he caught a glimpse of the intruder, an elderly man in an expensive coat, his silver hair slicked back despite the storm. There was something calculated about his movements, something that spoke of dangerous competence. "These documents," the man said, and Marcus realized with horror that more papers had spilled from the chest, scattered across the basement floor in plain sight. "They tell quite a story, don't they? A story about mistakes, about necessary sacrifices, about the greater good." Marcus's hand found his cell phone in his pocket. Still no signal. He was trapped down here with a man who clearly had no intention of letting him leave with what he'd discovered. "The Hartwell family thought they were so clever," the intruder continued, bending down to collect the scattered documents. "Thought they could use what they knew to their advantage. They learned otherwise, just like you're about to learn." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Hartwell. That was his mother's maiden name. The name she'd abandoned when she married his father. The name she'd refused to discuss whenever he'd asked about her family. She'd always claimed they were all dead, that there was nothing to talk about. But if this house belonged to the Hartwells, if these documents were connected to his mother's family, the photograph in his hand suddenly made terrible sense. The woman holding the infant, he'd seen those features in old pictures of his mother. And the baby. "Ah, there we are," the man said, and Marcus realized the flashlight beam had found him. "Come out, Marcus. Yes, I know who you are. I've known since the moment you set foot in this house." Marcus stood slowly, his legs shaking. "How do you know my name?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Because I've been watching your family for 30 years, boy. Ever since your mother decided to disappear with something that belonged to us, something very valuable that we've been looking for ever since. My mother never... Your mother was Sarah Hartwell before she became Sarah Brennan, and Sarah Hartwell witnessed something she shouldn't have, took something that wasn't hers, and vanished into thin air. We always wondered what happened to her. Imagine our surprise when a blizzard drove her son straight back to where it all began." The man stepped closer, and Marcus could see his eyes now, cold, calculating, utterly without mercy. "The question now," the man continued, "is whether you're going to be smart and walk away from this, or whether you're going to end up like the rest of your family, permanently buried beneath this house." The flashlight beam cut through the basement darkness as Marcus descended the creaking wooden stairs, each step groaning under his weight. The air grew thicker with each breath, heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic that made his stomach clench. Behind him, Sarah's footsteps echoed, hesitant but determined. "Jesus Christ," she whispered as the light swept across the basement floor. The bones weren't scattered randomly. They were arranged in neat rows, like a grotesque inventory. Small skulls, tiny rib cages, femurs no longer than Marcus's forearm, children's remains, dozens of them, laid out with clinical precision on makeshift tables constructed from sawhorses and plywood. Marcus's hand trembled, causing the flashlight beam to dance erratically across the macabre display. "How many?" Sarah moved closer to one of the tables, her face pale in the reflected light. "I count at least 30. Her voice was barely audible. "Maybe more." Tags hung from each skeleton, yellowed pieces of paper tied with string to the larger bones. Marcus approached the nearest table and leaned in to read one. The ink had faded, but he could make out numbers and what looked like dates. 1987, 1989, 1993. "They're catalogued," he said, his voice hoarse, like specimens. Sarah had moved to the far corner where filing cabinets lined the wall. She tugged at one of the drawers, and it opened with a metallic screech. "Marcus, you need to see this." The drawer was filled with manila folders, each one thick with documentation. Sarah pulled one out and opened it. Inside were photographs, before and after shots that made Marcus turn away, medical notes written in precise handwriting, measurements, observations. "Dr. Edmund Carver," Sarah read from a letterhead. "Chief Medical Examiner, 1985 to 1998. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. He knew that name. Everyone in town did. Carver Elementary School, Carver Memorial Park. The man was a local hero, credited with modernizing the county's medical facilities and establishing the children's hospital. "This can't be right," Marcus said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow. The evidence surrounded them, undeniable and horrific. Sarah continued reading, her voice growing stronger with anger. "Listen to this. Subject displayed remarkable resilience. Procedure extended 47 minutes before cardiac failure. Subject Marcus. He's talking about a child like it's a lab rat." More folders revealed the scope of the horror. Children from surrounding counties, mostly from poor families, runaways, kids from broken homes. Kids no one would miss, or whose disappearances could be easily explained away. The files documented medical experiments that belonged in the darkest chapters of history, not in a small American town in the 1990s. Marcus found himself looking at a photograph pinned to the inside of one folder. A young girl, maybe 8 years old, staring at the camera with frightened eyes. Below it, another photo of the same girl on a metal table, tubes running from her small body to machines that hummed in the background. "The hospital," he said suddenly. "The children's hospital that made Carver famous. He was using it as his personal laboratory." Sarah nodded grimly. And when the kids died from his experiments, he brought them here, kept them like trophies. She gestured to another section of files. Look at this. He was funded. Government contracts. Something called the Prometheus Initiative. The name meant nothing to Marcus, but the dollar amounts on the contracts made his head spin. Millions of dollars had flowed into Carver's research over the course of more than a decade, research that had apparently required a steady supply of vulnerable children. My God, Sarah breathed, staring at another document. The town council knew. The mayor, the police chief, the hospital board, they all signed off on this. They were all part of it. The worst part was realizing how the conspiracy had to work. Officials who looked the other way when children went missing, police reports that were filed and forgotten, social workers who were reassigned when they asked too many questions, an entire system corrupted to feed one man's monstrous appetites. Marcus's phone buzzed, startling him. A text message from an unknown number. You have something that belongs to me. Return it or join the children in the basement. The temperature in the basement seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus showed Sarah the message, and her face went white. They know we're here, she whispered. From upstairs came the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor above their heads, deliberate and unhurried. Someone was searching the house room by room. Marcus grabbed as many files as he could carry while Sarah stuffed photographs into her jacket. They needed evidence, proof of what had happened here. But first, they needed to survive long enough to use it. The footsteps stopped directly above them. The static from Marcus's radio crackled through the house like electricity, each burst making Tom's heart pound harder. He pressed himself against the kitchen wall, listening to the urgent voices bleeding through the storm. Confirm the target location. Proceed with extreme caution. Eliminate all witnesses. Tom's blood turned to ice water. They weren't coming to rescue him. They were coming to kill him. He grabbed the radio, fingers trembling as he adjusted the frequency. Marcus? Marcus, can you hear me? Silence stretched for an eternity before Marcus's voice came through, barely a whisper. Tom, thank God. Listen to me very carefully. They think I'm dead. The avalanche, I barely made it to an old mining shelter. But they're coming for you. I heard them on your radio. Who are they? Sheriff's department, but not all of them. It's bigger than we thought, Tom. The corruption goes all the way up. Deputy Collins is clean. She's been investigating the department for months. But Sheriff Hawthorne... Marcus's voice faded into static. Marcus! Here. The storm's getting worse, but I think I can make it to you. Whatever you found down there, it's worth killing for. Guard it with your life. The radio went dead. Tom stared at the device, his mind reeling. Sheriff Hawthorne, the man he'd known since childhood, who'd taught him to fish, who'd spoken at his father's funeral. The betrayal cut deeper than the cold ever could. A sound outside made him freeze, the faint rumble of an engine growing louder despite the howling wind. They were here. Tom bolted for the basement, taking the stairs 3 at a time. He snatched up the metal box containing the photographs and documents, his mind racing through possible hiding places. The house offered few options, and if they brought equipment, they'd find anything he concealed upstairs. But the tunnel system, that was different. He'd barely explored beyond the main chamber, but there had been other passages branching off into darkness. If he could get deep enough into the underground network, maybe he could wait them out. The sound of car doors slamming echoed from outside. Heavy boots crunched through the snow. Tom grabbed the flashlight and plunged into the tunnel entrance, pulling the loose boards back into place behind him. It wouldn't fool anyone for long, but it might buy him precious minutes. The underground passage felt different now, not just cold and cramped, but alive with menace. Every shadow could hide an enemy, every sound could herald his death. He moved as quickly as he dared through the main chamber, past the skeletal remains of Elena Kowalski, toward the narrow opening he'd noticed earlier. Above him, he heard the front door of the house splinter. Heavy footsteps thundered across the floor. Spread out, a voice commanded. Tom recognized it. Deputy Harrison, a man he'd trusted. Check every room. He's here somewhere. Tom squeezed through the narrow passage. The metal box clutched against his chest. The tunnel curved sharply to the left, then opened into another chamber, smaller than the first but with multiple exits. He chose the passage that angled deepest underground, hoping it would muffle sound. "Sir, there's evidence of digging in the basement," Harrison's voice echoed down from above, distorted by the floors and earth between them. "Find the entrance. Burn the whole place down if you have to, but make sure he doesn't leave alive." Sheriff Hawthorne's voice sent a chill through Tom that had nothing to do with the cold. The man spoke about murder with the casual tone he'd once used to discuss fishing licenses. Tom pressed deeper into the tunnel network, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of him. The passage here was older, more roughly hewn. Water had seeped through the walls and frozen into bizarre ice formations that caught his light like crystal chandeliers. Behind him, the sound of splintering wood echoed through the tunnels. They'd found the entrance. He moved faster, the beam of his flashlight revealing junction after junction in the underground maze. Some passages were blocked by cave-ins, others disappeared into flooded sections that had frozen solid. Tom chose his path by instinct, always heading deeper, always moving away from the voices that now echoed behind him. The tunnel he followed began to slope upward, and fresh air touched his face. An exit, but where would it lead? Into the arms of more corrupt deputies, or to safety? Tom paused at what felt like another chamber, his light revealing something that made his heart stop. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt floor, leading to a metal door set into the tunnel wall. This wasn't just an old mining operation or bootlegger's hideout. This was still in use. The metal box in his hands suddenly felt heavier, its contents more dangerous than he'd imagined. Whatever secret these tunnels held, it wasn't buried in the past. It was very much alive. Behind him, flashlight beams began to penetrate the darkness, growing closer with each passing second. The radio crackled to life in Marcus's trembling hands, Sheriff Coleman's voice, cutting through the static like a blade through silk. "Marcus, you there? We need to talk." Marcus stared at the device, his heart hammering against his ribs. Below him, the basement seemed to exhale cold air that carried the weight of 30 years of silence. He thought of Sarah Chen's terrified face in those photographs, of the construction records bearing his father's signature, of the bones that lay scattered in the frozen earth beneath his feet. "Marcus?" Coleman's voice grew sharper. "I know you're listening." With a shaking finger, Marcus pressed the talk button. "I'm here." "Good. Now listen carefully. There's been a misunderstanding about what you think you found down there." Coleman's tone was measured, almost fatherly. Sometimes old houses play tricks on a man's mind, especially when he's been trapped, cold, maybe not thinking straight. Marcus closed his eyes. Through the basement walls he could hear the wind beginning to pick up again, but something else rode beneath it, the distant rumble of engines. They were coming. "No tricks, Sheriff. I know what I found. Sarah Chen, the others, all of it." A long pause stretched across the airwaves. When Coleman spoke again, his voice had shed any pretense of warmth. "Your father was a good man, Marcus. Kept his mouth shut when it mattered. Smart man. You could be smart too." "My father knew?" The words escaped as barely a whisper. "Your father helped build half this town, boy, including the foundation you're standing on. He understood that sometimes sacrifice is necessary for the greater good. 5 families feeding their children versus one girl who was already lost to the drugs, already headed nowhere." Marcus felt the world tilt beneath him. Every job site barbecue, every handshake between his father and the town's elite, every time his father had insisted that loyalty to the community came first, all of it suddenly crystallized into a horrifying clarity. "She wasn't lost," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength. "She was 19 years old. She was a junkie who saw something she shouldn't have seen. Wrong place, wrong time. The development deal was worth $12 million, Marcus. Jobs for hundreds of families. A future for this whole town. Sometimes hard choices have to be made." The engine sounds were getting closer. Marcus moved to the small basement window and peered through the frost-covered glass. Headlights cut through the swirling snow, still distant but approaching fast. What did she see? Coleman's laugh was bitter. Environmental reports, soil contamination that would have killed the whole project. But Sarah, she was working part-time for the testing company, making copies of everything. Smart girl, just not smart enough to keep her mouth shut. Marcus thought of the industrial burn pit he'd discovered in his research, the chemical company that had operated on this land decades before. The town's golden development project had been built on poisoned ground, and Sarah Chen had died for threatening to expose it. So you killed her. Solved a problem, quick and clean. She didn't suffer. Coleman's voice carried the casual indifference of a man discussing the weather. Could have ended there, but you had to start digging. Literally. The headlights were closer now, maybe half a mile away. Marcus counted at least 3 vehicles, their beams sweeping back and forth across the snow-covered landscape like searchlights hunting prey. And the others in the basement? Complications. People who got too curious over the years. A reporter in '98. A state inspector in 2003. Your friend Jake just last week. Coleman's voice turned regretful. Jake was asking questions about his grandfather's land, about why the family got paid so little when everyone else got rich. Some questions don't have answers that people want to hear. Marcus felt ice crystallize in his veins. Jake. His friend's easy smile flashed through his memory, followed immediately by the image of broken bones in the darkness below. You're all monsters. We're pragmatists, son. This town was dying before the development. Now it thrives. Good people have good lives because we made hard choices. Your father understood that. The question is whether you're your father's son. The first vehicle had reached the driveway. Through the window, Marcus could see Coleman's patrol car, followed by 2 dark SUVs. Men in heavy coats were already climbing out, their movements purposeful and coordinated. Think carefully, Marcus, Coleman continued. You can walk out of there, take a generous settlement, and build a new life somewhere far away. Or you can join your friend Jake in the basement. The choice is yours, but you've got about 2 minutes to make it. Marcus looked down at the radio, then at the basement entrance where 30 years of secrets lay buried in the frozen ground. Outside, boots crunched through snow as they surrounded the house. He had to choose between survival and truth, between his father's legacy and his own soul. The footsteps reached the front porch. The basement felt different now, charged with a malevolent energy that seemed to pulse from the walls themselves. Jake's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing details he'd missed before in his panic. The ritual circle wasn't just carved into the concrete, it was burned in, as if extreme heat had scorched the patterns permanently into the floor. Sarah knelt beside one of the skeletal remains, her face pale but determined. "These aren't random victims," she whispered, pointing to something glinting near the skull. "Look." Jake moved closer and saw it. A small silver pendant, tarnished with age but still recognizable. The same symbol from the photographs upstairs, the same mark that had been carved into his own basement wall as a child. His hand unconsciously moved to the scar on his shoulder, the one his mother had always claimed came from falling off his bike. "There are more," Sarah said, moving to examine the other remains. Each skeleton wore similar jewelry, all bearing variations of the same twisted symbol. This wasn't just murder, Jake. This was systematic, organized. A sound from upstairs froze them both, the distinctive creak of the front door opening. Jake immediately killed the flashlight, plunging them into absolute darkness. They held their breath, listening to the measured footsteps above. Not the frantic movement of someone seeking shelter, but the deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. "Down here," a voice called out, echoing through the house. "I know you're down there, son." Jake's blood turned to ice. He recognized that voice from childhood memories he'd tried so hard to bury. Chief Morrison, but not as Jake had ever heard him before. Gone was the friendly authority figure who used to pat his head at town picnics. This voice carried the weight of decades of secrets, cold and calculating. "Sarah," Jake breathed, so quietly it was barely audible. He grabbed her hand and began moving toward what he hoped was another exit from the basement. The beam of a powerful flashlight began dancing across the stairs. "Jacob Hartley," Morrison continued, his footsteps now on the basement stairs. "Your mother tried so hard to keep you away from all this. Such a shame she couldn't let sleeping dogs lie." The words hit Jake like physical blows. His mother hadn't died in an accident. The certainty of it settled in his chest like a stone. Morrison's light swept across the ritual circle, and Jake caught a glimpse of the man's face in the reflected glow. It was a mask of calm control, but his eyes held something hungry and terrible. "Found an old root cellar," Sarah whispered, tugging at what felt like a wooden door set low in the wall. It opened with a groan that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. "Ah, there we are," Morrison said pleasantly, his light swinging toward the sound. "Come now, this doesn't have to be difficult. You've seen what you came to see. Let's discuss this like civilized people." Jake pushed Sarah through the narrow opening first, then squeezed through himself just as Morrison's flashlight beam reached their position. The root cellar was cramped and musty, but Jake could feel cold air moving across his face. There had to be another way out. They crawled forward through the darkness, following the air current, while behind them, Morrison's voice took on a more menacing tone. "Your mother thought she could expose us, too. Thought she could just waltz into the city with her photographs and her stories. Do you know how deep this goes, boy? How many important people have invested in keeping certain truths buried?" The crawl space opened into what felt like a larger chamber. Jake risked turning on his phone's dim light and immediately wished he hadn't. They were in some kind of storage room, and the walls were lined with photographs. Hundreds of them. Photos of the rituals, of victims, of town officials and state politicians participating in ceremonies that defied rational explanation. "My God," Sarah breathed, staring at the wall of evidence. "This has been going on for decades." Jake's light fell on a section of newer photographs, and his legs nearly gave out. There was his mother, bound and terrified, in what was clearly the same basement they'd just escaped from. The date stamp showed it was from 3 years ago, just weeks before her supposed accident. "Found the back way out yet?" Morrison called, his voice now coming from the root cellar behind them. "That tunnel leads to the old mine shaft, about 100-foot drop straight down. Lots of folks have had unfortunate accidents there over the years." Jake grabbed as many photographs as he could stuff into his jacket, focusing on the ones that clearly showed faces. Evidence, proof that this nightmare was real and had been happening under everyone's noses for generations. The sound of Morrison struggling through the tight space spurred them forward. Ahead, Jake could see a faint grey light, daylight filtering down from above. The mine shaft, but maybe also their only chance at escape. "This way," he told Sarah, though he had no idea what they'd find when they reached that distant light. The abandoned Sinclair factory loomed before Jack like a monument to decay, its broken windows staring down at him through the swirling snow. His breath came in ragged puffs as he pressed his back against the rusted fence, clutching the evidence files against his chest. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but he knew they were still out there, circling like wolves. Sarah emerged from the shadows beside him, her face pale with exhaustion. "This is insane, Jack. We should have gone to the state police." "With what proof?" He gestured toward the factory. "Everything we need is in there. The real records, the ones they couldn't destroy because they were locked away with the bodies." The storm had intensified, providing cover but also making every step treacherous. Jack studied the factory's perimeter, noting the gaps in the fence where decades of neglect had taken their toll. According to Martha's journal, the basement vault containing the original construction documents was accessible through the old supervisor's office. "Martha wrote that her father hid copies of everything down there," Jack said, wiping snow from his eyes. "Financial records, correspondence, the real safety reports. If we can prove the mine shaft collapse was intentional." A gunshot cracked through the air, followed by the whine of a ricochet off nearby metal. Sarah grabbed Jack's arm, pulling him toward a gap in the fence. They scrambled through, the barbed wire catching at their clothes as more shots erupted behind them. Inside the factory grounds, the wind howled between the skeletal remains of machinery. Jack led Sarah through a maze of rusted equipment toward the main building, his mind racing through Martha's detailed descriptions. The supervisor's office was on the second floor, northeast corner. From there, a hidden staircase led to the basement vault. They reached the building's entrance, a heavy steel door hanging askew on broken hinges. Jack pushed it open carefully, the screech of metal on metal making him wince. The interior was a cavern of shadows and decay, but it was shelter from the storm. "This way," he whispered, pulling out his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a floor littered with debris and the skeletal remains of office furniture. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, a steady rhythm that matched his pounding heart. They climbed a rusted staircase, each step groaning under their weight. Jack's flashlight illuminated graffiti and water stains on the walls, decades of abandonment written in rust and neglect. The supervisor's office door stood open, revealing a room picked clean by scavengers. But Martha's directions were precise. Jack moved to the far wall and began counting ceiling tiles. The seventh one from the corner was loose, just as she'd written. Behind it, his fingers found a hidden lever. The wall section swung inward with surprising smoothness, revealing a narrow staircase descending into blackness. The air that rushed up was cold and stale, carrying the scent of old paper and machine oil. "Jesus," Sarah breathed. How did Martha know about this? Her father was the last supervisor before they shut down. He suspected what was coming and hid everything he could. Jack started down the stairs, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of them. The town council needed the mine shaft disaster to justify condemning this whole district. More federal money for redevelopment. The basement vault was a time capsule. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their contents preserved by the dry, cold air. Jack went straight to the cabinet Martha had specified, his hands shaking as he pulled open the drawers. The files were all there. Purchase orders for substandard materials, correspondence between Mayor Hendricks and state officials about development grants, and most damning of all, geological surveys showing the mine shafts were structurally sound, dated 1 week before the accidental collapse that killed 18 men. "Look at this," Sarah said from across the room. She held up a photograph showing a younger Mayor Hendricks shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit. The signature on the back says, "To Bill, thanks for making Millbrook ready for the future, Senator Morrison." Jack felt the pieces falling into place. The mine disaster, the federal grants, the systematic buyout of the old district. It had all been orchestrated, and Martha's family had been killed because they'd gotten too close to the truth. Footsteps echoed from somewhere above them. Jack stuffed the most crucial documents into his jacket, while Sarah grabbed the photograph and additional files. They needed to get out, but the hidden staircase was the only way up. "There's got to be another exit," Jack whispered, scanning the room. Martha's journal had mentioned something about utility tunnels connecting to the old mine works. Behind the last filing cabinet they found it. A low tunnel entrance sealed with a wooden door. Jack pried it open, revealing a narrow passage that disappeared into darkness. As voices grew louder above them, Jack and Sarah crawled into the tunnel, carrying with them the evidence that would finally expose the truth about Millbrook's buried secrets. The basement door slammed shut above them with a finality that made Sarah's stomach clench. Heavy footsteps paced overhead, followed by the scrape of something being dragged across the floor. Marcus was barricading them in. "There has to be another way out," Jake whispered, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The basement felt like a tomb, carved from ice and desperation. Sarah pulled out her phone's flashlight, the pale beam revealing stone walls that wept with condensation. Wooden shelves lined one wall, filled with mason jars whose contents had long since frozen solid. But it was the far corner that drew their attention, where the beam illuminated something that shouldn't exist. A tunnel opening, roughly hewn into the rock. "Jesus," Jake breathed, moving toward it. "This goes under the whole town." Sarah followed, her light revealing crude wooden supports and walls marked with decades of chisel marks. The tunnel stretched into darkness, but she could feel air movement, cold but fresh. "It's not just a tunnel," she said, studying the systematic way it had been carved. "It's part of something bigger." They had no choice but to enter. Behind them, Marcus's voice carried through the door, speaking to someone on the phone. His words were muffled, but the urgency was clear. The tunnel was barely wide enough for them to walk single file. Jake led, using his own phone light to supplement Sarah's. The walls bore markings, not just tool marks, but symbols carved into the stone. Crude drawings that looked almost ritualistic. "Sarah," Jake called softly from ahead, "you need to see this." She squeezed past him into a wider chamber. Her light swept across the space, and she gasped. The walls were covered in photographs, documents, and newspaper clippings, all protected by plastic sheeting. Decades of collected evidence, meticulously organized and preserved. "It's like a shrine," she whispered, moving closer to examine the items. Photos of children, dozens of them. Some she recognized from missing person reports that had crossed her desk over the years. Others were older, their clothing and hairstyles dating back decades. Jake was studying a section of documents. "Look at these names." His voice was tight with recognition. Patterson, Walsh, Hendricks, every major family in town. Sarah joined him, her light revealing what appeared to be meeting minutes, written in careful handwriting. The dates spanned 40 years. "The Preservation Society," she read aloud. "Jesus, Jake. It wasn't just about the mill. It was never just about the mill." The documents painted a horrifying picture. Children taken not randomly, but carefully selected. Families who asked too many questions relocated, or worse. A systematic operation designed to keep certain secrets buried while maintaining the town's carefully constructed facade. "Here," Jake said, pulling a thick folder from the collection. Inside were architectural plans, not just of the mill, but of a network of tunnels connecting key buildings throughout the town. The mayor's office, the police station, the old church, even the newspaper building where Sarah worked. They've been watching everything, she realized, every investigation, every story. They knew what we were doing before we did. A sound from the tunnel behind them made them both freeze. Footsteps, moving carefully but getting closer. Marcus had found their route. Jake grabbed several files, stuffing them into his jacket. Sarah did the same, focusing on the most recent documents and the tunnel maps. As they worked, her light fell on something that made her blood turn to ice. A recent photograph, clearly taken with a telephoto lens. It showed her and Jake outside the diner 3 days ago, before any of this had started. Before Jake had even been trapped in the house. Someone had been watching them long before they'd stumbled onto the truth. "We need to move," Jake urged, but Sarah was staring at another photo. This one showed a young girl she recognized, Emma Walsh, the mayor's niece who had gone missing 2 years ago. The case had been closed quickly, attributed to a runaway situation. But Emma was in this photo, and she wasn't running away. She was being led somewhere by a man whose face was partially visible. Marcus Walsh, the mayor's own brother. "Sarah!" Jake's urgent whisper snapped her attention back. The footsteps were much closer now, and they could hear Marcus talking to someone else. He wasn't alone. They gathered what they could and moved deeper into the tunnel system. The maps showed multiple exits, but also revealed the true scope of what they were dealing with. The tunnels connected to a dozen buildings, creating a hidden network that had operated beneath the town's surface for decades. As they fled through the darkness, Sarah clutched the evidence against her chest. They finally had proof of what had been happening, but they were still trapped underground with killers closing in. The tunnel ahead split into 3 directions, and behind them the voices were getting closer. The town's deepest secret was finally exposed, but exposing it and surviving to tell the story were 2 very different things. The abandoned house groaned against the wind as Marcus knelt beside Sarah's unconscious form, his hands trembling as he checked her pulse. Weak but steady. Blood seeped from a gash on her forehead where she'd struck the frozen ground when Donovan's men had thrown her down the cellar stairs. Above them, footsteps pounded across the floorboards. Voices carried down through the rotting wood, Donovan coordinating with someone on a radio, arranging for cleanup and disposal. Marcus knew they had minutes, maybe less, before those boots came down the stairs for good. The cellar stretched deeper than he'd initially realized, disappearing into darkness beyond his flashlight's reach. When he'd first broken through the floor days ago, he'd only seen the immediate horror, the small bones, the children's belongings. But now, following the beam of light deeper into the underground space, he could see this wasn't just a burial site, it was a network. Crude tunnels branched off from the main chamber, hand-dug passages that disappeared into the earth. Marcus had heard stories about the old bootlegging operations during Prohibition, how some of the town's founding families had built elaborate underground systems to move liquor. But these tunnels felt different, newer sections mixed with older ones, expanded and maintained long after the need for hidden alcohol had passed. Sarah stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Marcus?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here. Can you move?" She tried to sit up, wincing. "My head feels like it's splitting open. Where are they?" "Upstairs, planning our funerals." Marcus helped her to her feet, steadying her against the earthen wall. "But I think there might be a way out." He'd been studying the tunnel system while she was unconscious, following the air currents with his flashlight. One passage seemed to angle upward, and he could feel a faint breeze coming from its depths, cold, fresh air that suggested an opening somewhere above. The footsteps upstairs suddenly stopped. In the silence that followed, Marcus heard the distinctive creak of the cellar door opening. "Move," he whispered, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her toward the tunnel entrance. They plunged into the narrow passage just as the first beam of light stabbed down from above. Behind them, shouts echoed as Donovan's men discovered the empty cellar. Heavy boots thundered across the floor above, and Marcus realized they were spreading out, probably heading outside to surround the house. "There!" Sarah gasped, pointing ahead. A pale square of grey light appeared in the distance, not bright, but distinctly different from the absolute darkness around them. They crawled faster, ignoring the rough wood that scraped their backs and the frozen earth that bit into their knees. The tunnel began to slope more steeply upward. Marcus could hear Sarah breathing heavily behind him, probably fighting off a concussion, but she kept moving. The light grew stronger, and he could feel wind against his face. They emerged through a hidden opening beneath a massive fallen tree about 50 yards from the house. Snow had drifted against the log, creating a natural camouflage for the tunnel entrance. Marcus helped Sarah crawl out, both of them gasping in the frigid air. Through the swirling snow, they could see flashlight beams moving around the house. Dark figures trudged through the drifts, searching. But the storm was intensifying again, and visibility was dropping rapidly. "My truck," Sarah whispered, pointing through the trees. "It's about 100 yards that way, behind the old barn." They moved carefully, using the storm as cover. The snow was knee-deep now, making every step exhausting, but it also muffled sound and reduced visibility for their pursuers. As they reached the truck, Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm. "Wait." Something had been nagging at him since they'd escaped the tunnel. Those passages, they weren't just old bootlegging routes. Some of them were newer, recently maintained. Sarah's face was pale in the truck's dim interior light as she fumbled for her keys. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this isn't just about covering up something that happened decades ago. Those tunnels connect to other places, other houses, other properties. This whole thing might still be active." The engine turned over with a reluctant groan. Sarah put the truck in gear, but before they could move, headlights blazed through the rear window. A black SUV was pushing through the snow toward them, and in the distance, Marcus could see more lights converging on their position. "They've got radios," Sarah said grimly. They were coordinating the whole time. The SUV accelerated, its heavy frame cutting through the snow like it wasn't there. Marcus could see they wouldn't make it to the road before being cut off. "Turn left," he said suddenly. "Toward the old mine road. That's a dead end. Trust me." The sheriff's cruiser fishtailed through the snow as Marcus fought to maintain control, his wounded shoulder screaming with each sharp turn. In the rearview mirror, headlights cut through the blizzard like predatory eyes, gaining ground despite his desperate speed. The journal lay open on the passenger seat, pages fluttering in the cold air rushing through the bullet hole in his rear window. He had to reach the state police barracks in Millfield, 20 miles through mountain roads that were barely passable in good weather. But Sheriff Hawkins and his men knew these roads better than anyone, and they had better equipment. Marcus's chances of outrunning them were slim to none. The radio crackled with cross-chatter between the pursuing vehicles. Hawkins's voice cut through the static, cold and methodical, block Route 47 at Miller's Bend. "He's heading for the State, boys, but he won't make it that far." Marcus grabbed the radio. "This is Officer Marcus Webb. Sheriff Hawkins and Deputy Collins are involved in multiple murders spanning 30 years. The evidence is—" A gunshot shattered his side mirror. In the swirling snow behind him, he could see Collins leaning out the passenger window of Hawkins's cruiser, rifle raised. Another shot punched through his trunk. The road curved sharply ahead, Miller's Bend. If they'd already positioned cars there, he was trapped. Marcus made a split-second decision and yanked the wheel hard left, sending his cruiser careening off the main road onto a narrow forestry trail. Branches scraped against his windows as he plunged into the dense woods. The trail was barely wide enough for one vehicle, winding between massive pine trees that formed a tunnel of darkness. His headlights illuminated only a few feet ahead, revealing treacherous patches of ice and fallen logs. Behind him, the pursuing vehicles had hesitated at the trail entrance. They knew as well as he did that this path could be a death trap. But Marcus also knew something they might not. This trail connected to the old mining road that led back toward town from the north. If he could reach it, he might be able to circle around to the highway and make it to Millfield after all. The cruiser bucked and lurched over the rough terrain. His shoulder wound had reopened, and he could feel warm blood soaking through his jacket. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that made it hard to focus. More than once, he nearly crashed into the trees as micro-sleeps overtook him. A new sound reached him over the engine's laboring, the deep rumble of a snowplow. Collins's voice came over the radio, got him boxed in. "Plow trucks coming up the mining road. He's got nowhere to go." Marcus's heart sank. They'd anticipated his route, probably had contingencies for every possible escape path. He was a mouse in a maze, and they controlled all the exits. But as he rounded another bend, his headlights revealed something unexpected, a gap in the trees where another, even narrower path branched off to the right. It was barely more than a hiking trail, probably impassable for any normal vehicle, but his cruiser had all-wheel drive and heavy-duty tires. It was a long shot, but it was his only shot. He took the turn without slowing, immediately feeling the cruiser bottom out as it scraped over hidden rocks. The path was so narrow that branches scraped both sides simultaneously. In some places he had to ram through fallen logs, the impact sending shock waves through his injured shoulder. The trail seemed to go on forever, climbing steadily into the mountains. His fuel gauge was dropping toward empty, and the engine was starting to overheat from the abuse. Just when he thought he might have to abandon the vehicle and continue on foot, the trees opened up and he found himself on a snow-covered meadow. In the distance, he could see lights, not the harsh glare of emergency vehicles, but the warm glow of house windows, a small cluster of cabins, probably a hunting camp. And beyond that, barely visible through the snow, the ribbon of asphalt that was Route 15, the back way to Millfield. Marcus gunned the engine across the meadow, praying the snow wasn't deep enough to bog him down. The cruiser's tires found purchase on the frozen ground beneath, and within minutes he was pulling onto the blessed smooth pavement of the highway. He reached for the radio to call the state police, then stopped. How could he be sure Hawkins hadn't already contacted them with some story about a rogue officer who'd snapped under pressure? Who would they believe? A respected small-town sheriff or a construction worker turned cop with wild stories about decades-old conspiracies? Marcus looked down at the journal beside him, its pages filled with the careful documentation of 30 years of murder and cover-ups. The evidence was all there, but he needed someone he could trust absolutely to hear him out, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. He knew exactly who that was. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a crystalline silence that seemed to mock the chaos of the past 3 days. Jake stood at the edge of the mass grave, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as he watched Sheriff Martinez coordinate with the state police. The abandoned house loomed behind him, its broken windows now bearing witness to the truth it had hidden for so long. 47 bodies, Martinez said, approaching with a grim expression. Most of them migrant workers from the 60s and 70s. The coroner's preliminary assessment suggests they were executed. She paused, studying Jake's face. You did the right thing calling this in. Jake nodded, though his stomach still churned at the memory of that first skeletal hand emerging from the earth. What about Councilman Morrison and his men? In custody. Morrison singing like a canary, trying to cut a deal. Turns out his father wasn't just the foreman, he was running a labor trafficking operation. When workers started asking too many questions about wages or threatened to contact authorities, they disappeared. Martinez kicked at a chunk of ice. The construction company, the city council, even some state officials were all in on it. Used the workers to build half the town, then eliminated them to avoid paying wages or dealing with potential whistleblowers. The weight of it settled on Jake like another blizzard. All those years growing up here, walking past this house, never knowing that dozens of people lay murdered beneath the frozen ground. People with families, dreams, lives cut short by greed and prejudice. There's something else, Martinez continued. We found records in Morrison's father's safe, birth certificates, employment documents. Jake, your father wasn't just a construction worker here. He was one of them, one of the workers they exploited. Jake's blood turned to ice water. What are you saying? Miguel Santos. That was his real name before he changed it to Michael Sanders. He managed to escape the night they came for his crew. The records show he witnessed the murders, but he was too terrified to come forward. He thought they'd kill him and his family if he spoke up. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. His father's nightmares, his reluctance to ever talk about his past, the way he'd flinch whenever anyone mentioned the old construction projects. It all made horrific sense now. He lived his whole life in fear, Jake whispered, knowing what happened, knowing he could have been one of those bodies. Martinez placed a hand on his shoulder. He survived, Jake. He built a life, raised a family, and now, because of what you found, those people down there will finally get justice. A black SUV pulled up through the snow, and Jake watched as FBI agents emerged. This was bigger than Morrison and his cronies now. The investigation would ripple outward, touching powerful families, established businesses, maybe even federal officials who had turned blind eyes to the disappearances. As the agents began their work, Jake found himself walking back toward the house. The basement where he'd sheltered from the storm looked different now. Not just a refuge from the cold, but the place where decades of silence had finally been broken. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, heard on the news about the discovery. Are you okay? Jake stared at the message, thinking about how to answer. Was he okay? He'd uncovered a massacre, learned his father had been living with survivors' guilt for 40 years, and painted a target on his back that would probably never fully disappear. But for the first time since the blizzard trapped him here, he felt something like peace. I will be, he texted back. Martinez appeared in the doorway. We'll need you to testify when this goes to trial. You know that, right? Morrison's lawyers will try to discredit you, claim you planted evidence or contaminated the scene. Let them try, Jake said. I know what I found. More importantly, those families deserve answers. Some of them probably never knew what happened to their fathers, brothers, sons. The FBI's already reaching out to Mexican authorities, trying to identify the remains and contact next of kin. It'll take time, but they'll get those answers. Jake nodded, taking one last look around the basement. In trying to save his own life, he'd stumbled into saving the memory of 47 others. It wasn't the kind of rescue he'd ever imagined making, but it felt right. Outside, the winter sun was beginning to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of orange and pink. The beauty felt surreal after everything that had happened, but maybe that was how healing began, with the contrast between darkness and light, between buried secrets and revealed truth. As Jake walked toward his truck, finally able to leave this place behind, he could almost feel his father's presence beside him. No more nightmares, no more guilt. The dead could rest now, and maybe, finally, so could the living.